I am incredibly excited for this podcast with my friend Rich Stoddart, who's known me since I was 18 years old at Dartmouth College. Rich was the president of the fraternity I joined when I was a freshman at Dartmouth, and he's been an actual leader really since then. And I learned a lot from him. He probably barely remembers me because he was a BMOC, big person on campus, and I was a pledge and an insignificant part of his life. But we've stayed friends, and I've followed his trajectory as a professional with incredible interest and admiration, just the way he leads. And Rich, thank you for making the time to do this today.
For sure. Happy to do it. And I kind of remember you.
Yeah, exactly. You vaguely remember me. Don't make me pull the pictures out because this is a video. But let's start a little bit with your path. You know, you were a leader at Dartmouth. You kind of had an ease about you with everyone you met, it seemed, at least from my vantage point. Talk about where that comes from. You know, what did you get from your upbringing that makes you such an accepting and easy person to be with?
Well, it's an interesting observation, Craig. And the fact that you didn't know me before Dartmouth probably gives you a different view of who I am. Had you known me in high school, you would have known me as the guy who spent most of his time down in the art studio. I was an art rat. I had hair past my shoulders. I loved Neil Young. I did a lot of stainless steel welding, and I was pretty much an introvert. My parents had sent me to a different school in junior high. I was hanging out with the wrong people. I was not excelling. They all got into lots of trouble. They sent me to a private school, which is super disruptive. And so I was super introverted. And I guess what I'd say is I think for some reason I chose to lean into totally different things at Dartmouth. I decided to put myself out there and just take some chances. I joined the Women's Issues League, was actually one of the founding members of the Women's Issues League. As you know, I joined the fraternity and learned that I could lead almost by doing so and being put in situations. And so I think lead by leading, do by doing is something I've always tried to say to my kids. You know, I always do give my kids advice when they went off to school and said, you have a chance to totally reinvent yourself should you choose to do so. And you have that chance when you go to college, for sure in your first job. I actually would submit to you, you have that chance in every career change. But I think most people aren't intentional about it. They don't decide what to keep and what to shed and what they want to adopt. And so while that was accidental for me, I've tried to be much more purposeful about it as I've gone through my career.
Yeah. How, if you look back, was there a moment where you had the awareness that you could be an example to others and that you could make connections maybe that weren't as comfortable to you in high school?
I would say, you know, we had a unique sort of on-campus pattern called the D plan at Dartmouth, and that forced us to be on campus as sophomores. Sophomore summer, it was called. So it's a little bit like Lord of the Flies, right? You're all sort of dropped onto campus. You're kind of running the whole college as sophomores, as 19-year-olds. You don't really know what you're doing. You have to make things work. There's no upperclassmen to show you the ropes. And that summer, I'm not sure I fully recall, but someone suggested to me that I should run for president. And that didn't seem comfortable to me at all. It was not easy. You know, some of the things you deal with in a group of young men who are finding their way in the world and whose brains aren't fully and judgment skills aren't fully formed, put you in some different situations. But I would say that moment, people put their trust in me, and I took it pretty seriously. That was something that I needed to not let those people whom I cared about deeply and still do today, not let them down. So that was probably a turning point for me.
Yeah. I mean, it was, I'm going to try not to say too many nice things because I don't want you to get used to this when we see each other outside of a podcast environment. But, you know, I remember how there was a line, of course, in a fraternity back then. It's changed dramatically since the 1980s when we were at Dartmouth. But I remember how you were, most people in the class 2 years ahead of us were not at all interested in including the members of our class in a conversation, or, it was kind of like, okay, you want to hang out with us, fine, but you watch and you learn and you listen. And I always remember that you weren't like that. You were kind of aware of everybody who was in the room and making them feel like they were kind of, maybe not perfectly equal, because there's a stratification in a fraternity that just exists at when somebody's a pledge or whatever. But I just remember that. And I also remember, and this is a little bit of a transition comment, I don't know why I remember this, and I forget which room it was, but we were sitting there and you were commenting. I don't think the TV was probably much bigger than this. Probably a 15-inch TV or something, but you were commenting on the commercials. We were in the room. I think our friend Mike Drescher might have been in the room with us, and you were just talking about what you saw in advertising. Did you know at that point that was kind of something that you got into, and what obviously your right brain that you were developing when you were an artist in high school and middle school contributed to that? But talk a little bit about that passion.
Yeah, that was another accidental, discovery. There is today. I've gone back and lectured for this one class, but there's one undergraduate class today on marketing. There was not one when I was there and when you were there. And so the entire field of marketing writ large was not something I was exposed to at all in my college experience. My dad was involved in marketing to some degree, but I was sort of blissfully probably unaware of all of that. I majored in American government because I thought, gee, this will be great. I'll be a lawyer. And I interned one summer at a white shoe law firm in Cleveland, my hometown. And I sat in the library every day and pulled out pages from that were old and put new pages in. That's basically what I did all summer. But they asked me to go around and talk to some of the partners, and I was kind of just demoralized. I thought the law was all about the little guy, and at this firm it really wasn't. And so I said, gee, I don't know if this is for me. And honestly, I fell into advertising at that time. They had a number of firms that would come on campus and do presentations in the fall to try to drum up interest for interviews in the spring. And I walked into both a Procter & Gamble presentation and a Leo Burnett presentation, the agency I ultimately joined, and was just transfixed. I mean, there is a business that is a blend of art and creativity as well as analysis and business. It's a commercial venture that sells art to sell product and build image. And I was like, this is it. This is exactly, I still have that art thing, that itch that I can scratch, but I can make a living. And so that was a really powerful moment for me. And that changed my entire focus from, I interviewed with every investment bank, with every sales, CPG sales company. And then I found marketing, and that was something I was confident that this is the right thing for me.
And are you a visual learner, or are you somebody who is better with words or better with seeing the storyboard kind of approach in marketing or advertising?
I think I am more of a visual learner in that I need to see the thing play itself out in a physical way, including the words, right? Words that sort of sit in the abstract aren't great for me. What I have found is that I'm a much better human and a much better person in my career when I'm working with other people. And a lot of people are afraid of that. It's like, well, it's shameful. Like, you should do it yourself. I often solve the problem. I just solve it best when I have someone to engage with, to draw energy off, to push my thinking, for me to push their thinking, and then to get to an outcome. And I think this sort of cult of one person does it all is super overrated.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You get nothing out of the vacuum that you hear when you're leading without collaboration. I could not agree more. I think of advertising and that level of marketing through, televised mediums and things, through the lens of Tom Hanks and Nothing in Common, which is one of my favorite movies, not just for the advertising piece, which I just love the way they pulled all those bits together, but the dad, son, dad, mom, the pressure with work. I mean, it feels timeless to me. Although when I show my kids that movie, they're like, Dad, this is a super old movie. And, not tearing up when you're tearing up. For those listening, and there will be a fair number of lawyers listening who probably have never experienced what an advertising agency does. Talk a little bit about the journey, the client journey, and dealing with your client, figuring out what the messages you're trying to communicate, and then how to translate that into the medium you're using to advertise.
Sure. So I'll try to just sort of boil it down into the big rock steps. So the first thing is figuring out what exactly is it we're trying to accomplish here, right? What is the business problem, challenge, opportunity? Do we need to sell more of this? Do we need to increase frequency of purchase? Do we need to increase penetration? Is it a new product that has never been seen before that people don't understand its function? Are we simply trying to make people feel better about the brand, right? So establishing some basic business metrics that sort of frame up the outcomes we seek. Then there is a phase around building a creative strategy, which includes both a lot of quantitative data around how human beings are behaving now. What are they doing? And beginning to define, well, what is it we want them to do differently than what they're doing now? And searching for insights, which is probably the most maddening part of this whole thing, other than the creative idea itself, which is, what is an insight? I'll give you one example that's one of my favorites. There's a pretty famous campaign that my agency did called Like a Girl for P&G Always. And the insight actually came from a social media strategist who said the whole premise of that campaign, it was called a POME campaign, right? Point of market entry. So the agenda here was to get young girls to adopt the brand because you knew that women tend to be loyal to that first brand that they adopt. Kotex had just come out with a Kotex, U by Kotex, black packaging, super sleek, high design, and always was losing market share. And a social media strategist, I believe it was out of the London office, just realized that people were using this phrase, like a girl, as a pejorative in the social media sphere. And so that idea became an insight that was turned into a creative idea. And the genesis of the idea was to actually turn Like a Girl into a positive rather than into a negative. Right. So it all sounds lovely and beautiful when you deconstruct the case study. But figuring out the insight is the next phase of the process. And then that insight is a springboard for creatives to start to build an idea. What could we do in different media channels? Is it broadcast? Is it visual? Is it a social media strategy? Working with the media function. And then ultimately, after all that work, comes the day you walk into the client's conference room and present them the ideas, and they say, I like it or I don't, which is perhaps the most difficult part of the industry, is that there is so much subjectivity. What is good? Yesterday, or I guess it was 2 days ago, we had a big football game called the Super Bowl, and every newspaper is judging who was good and who was bad. There's no way to judge other than by what you perceive to have been the efficacy of an idea that actually no one really knows what it really did out in the world.
Yeah, it's that would be unnerving. So is there any part in the process where before you make the presentation, you think of Mad Men or Nothing in Common, where they make the pitch and it's kind of this binary yes or no. Is there a point in the process where you've got some inside consiglieres who are saying, that may not fly, that could fly, you're on the right track? Or is it really, you have a big initial meeting and then there's a presentation and they give you thumbs up or thumbs down?
Well, you're always trying to suss it out. I'm sure this is true in your field as well, right? It's not like, okay, so here we got a big case. Now we're going to go see the judge and the judge is going to decide. you have precedent, right? You know, the client has worked with you on the strategy. So they have approved the strategy. You are in their offices. So you have multiple touch points to try to understand, their culture. Right? Some clients are very risk averse. Others want risk. Their whole brand is built on, Nike would be the famous example, right? You don't just show up to any client and say, gee, let's do an ad with Colin Kaepernick. That's a very brave client who says, I'm going to take on controversy. I've always said, great brands have fans, but they also have enemies. Any brand that doesn't have enemies has no fans of any meaning, right? And so I do think you have multiple opportunities to try to begin to gauge that and understand it. You have the account people who are spending lots of time with the client. There is an inherent tension, though. The tension is the client simply wants the thing to work. They want it to achieve their marketing goals. The agency wants that, of course, because they'll be retained and won't get fired. But they also want to do something brilliant, something that's never been done before. They want to do a Apple, here's to the crazy ones. They want to do a 1984. They want to do a Kaepernick. They want to do a Like a Girl. And there's a lot of noise out there in advertising that's just sort of okay. It's so forgettable. You see these things driving down the road or listening to your radio or your podcast or whatever it is, and it makes no impression whatsoever. So the agency is looking for both of those things. I used to, for 5.5 years, I was on the client side. So I used to have the agency come in the room. And I said to them after my first meeting, and again, I bet this is probably true of your field. I said, you guys don't understand. The moment you walk into the conference room, I know whether you have something brilliant. It's like pheromones or something oozing out of your skin. And I can feel my stomach drop sometimes because I know they don't have squat. They're just going to try to dance their way through it today. And other times I'm like, I can't wait because they're going to put this beautiful, steak in front of me and they're going to bring me 3 ideas, all of which are brilliant. And I think we often fool ourselves because we rehearse and we prepare and we're all ready and we buttoned up. And people have an amazing sense about whether it's really there or not.
Is there a quality of the great professionals that you've led or worked with or seen on the client side? There are some qualities about those people. They get it more often than not. I mean, they may have bad days, but they get it. What are some of those qualities that you see?
So I would say students of human behavior, right? I guess I don't anymore, but I used to hang out in grocery store aisles. And when a woman would come along and pick up a box, my first account was Keebler crackers. So when she would pick up a box of Ritz, I'd say, why did you buy the Ritz? And usually you get a rational answer at first, but people don't do things for rational reasons, right? You didn't buy that shirt because it was on sale in the right size and it had the functional wicking. You actually thought it made you look good. And so human beings are creatures of needs. Yeah. Well, you thought it did. We'll discuss whether it actually does. Human beings are creatures of needs, wants, desires, and emotions. And we sometimes reduce everything to this rational level, and it isn't that. Otherwise, there wouldn't be marketing, right? It would just be, this one's better than that one. 9 out of 10 dentists, recommend Crest for cavities, and off we would go. And so I think understanding why and how people behave and how that behavior shifts is important. I think just being immersed in the culture. The culture is always changing, and advertising, although I would argue less so today than in the past where it really shaped culture. I think it sort of surfs off culture today, but it exists in the context of the culture. Again, what was the right tone for advertising post 9/11, post whatever political upheaval, post the financial crisis, post a pandemic? That changes the way you have to think about marketing. So I'd say human behavior, culture, and then I would just say hunger to learn. Like just deeply interested in, curious about all kinds of things, right? Advertising is not a sport for specialists. It's, that whole T-shaped concept. Yes, usually they're good at, I'm good at writing, but I'm interested in science and math and philosophy and religion, and it's a great place for people who have that kind of broad curiosity, and it requires it, I think.
Yeah, and you've definitely got that. I mean, I always tell my kids when before I introduce them to you, I said, what you're going to find about Mr. Stoddart is his arrogance to excellence ratio, which I've talked about before on this podcast, is at the highest level. Where he is going to be more interested in you than about any adult you're ever going to want to meet. But the key is for you to also understand, because he's going to have a lot that you can ask him that will be really helpful to you. And so, I wonder if some of that was innate because I saw it before you went to Leo Burnett, but, that quality. And I think that is with lawyers, I always tell people to read the book, How to Be Heard, by Julian Treasure, he's an audiophile who teaches people that to be persuasive, you have to listen, because that gives confidence that the person has been heard, and then you can translate that into a strategy. I think that's so important with lawyers who feel like, so many times we get up and give a presentation, or we talk about our perspective in a deal, or give a closing argument. But the best lawyers listen to their clients and figure out how to craft a business solution, which is what you're talking about in the advertising space. You mentioned something interesting I wanted to follow up on. We do have these demarcations in our culture, and I feel like advertising, I think we did see it in the Super Bowl on Sunday, things that would not have been done during the Kaepernick, Neal era of the NFL, is front and center. The NFL does an announcement in the prime spot right after first half ends about the $250 million contribution they're going to give to Black Lives Matter and making our world a more fair and equal place. What was it, George Floyd? What was the moment where you saw the advertising world open up on the issues of race and really be more intentional about inclusiveness, with who the actors were in the ads and who the audiences they're appealing to?
Well, I don't think it's just advertising is more attuned to race, right? The whole world, the whole human body is more attuned to this. And unfortunately, long after it should have been, there still are agencies that specialize in African-American consumer. When I was at Ford, we had a African-American ad agency, a Hispanic ad agency, a general market ad agency. Now, recently, in the last decade, there's become a trend toward what's called a total market approach, which says, well, there's really just one market, and what you should do is market to a sort of universal insight. I think that's sort of falling apart again, because there isn't a total market. There are micro markets, right? And so, one of the challenges always with advertising is scale is your friend. You're trying to advertise at scale. That's why television's still around. You want to reach a lot of people. But scale messages don't work the way they used to. And actually, the atomization of messaging right across every platform from TikTok to Pinterest to, again, a TV channel. And I think you'll start to see over time that there will be, and it's already happened, lots more micro messages targeted to audiences, which is becoming enabled. And ultimately, some suggest, and I hope I'm not around for the time that this happens, that machine learning will ultimately be able to create a message for Craig Budner that's different for everyone else, be able to A, B, C, D, E test it, know what works, and there won't be any ad agency. There'll just be a little box that figures out what makes you do things. Again, I hope I'm not around for that day. That day, they'll be writing novels and making movies and all of that as well, right?
I know. I mean, I guess that's what in part scared us by the politicization of Facebook and how they targeted these political messages for the people they thought liked the things that made them receptive to those particular ads. I mean, I agree with you. It takes a little bit of the human element, or a lot of the human element out of it, but I think we're getting there slowly but surely. So I do want to take it to the micro level before I get to your leadership path, which I really want to get to as well, and talk about the concept of personal branding. So you see this with young professionals today, not just helping their client perpetuate their brand or advance their interests, but think about how they're going to be branded within their organization, how they're going to be branded outside of their organization, What are some things either you tell your girls or you've told people you mentor about in today's world, how to think about their brand and developing their personal brand?
Yeah, so I think there is a bit of a fetish around personal branding. And I think the mistake most people make is they go right to, well, I have to have a brand. And they don't do the work that actually advertising does, which begins with what's your strategy and what's your insight, right? So I'll tell you a bit of a story here. I'll try to keep it short, but I have a theory that the education system causes people, at least in this country, to focus on what they're innately worst at. Because when, Will came home with 5 A's, a B, and a C plus, Don and Craig said, hey, dude, what's going on with the C plus? Do we need to get you a tutor? Are you mailing it in? How can we help you? Do you need flashcards? Whatever it is. And so for all of that, whatever it is, 15, 18 years of education, you are transfixed with, the stuff that I'm bad at is where I need to focus my time. And in actuality, once you leave the educational world, I actually don't want that from you. I don't want you to bring what you're bad at into my workplace, into your firm. What you want people to do is to bring what they're best at and to be highly aware of what they're best at and then begin to try to round themselves out. And so that theory is worth everything you just paid for it. But I formed that theory because I was in the midst of a very difficult, we had won the Miller Lite business at my second agency. It was a giant win, a hugely esteemed account, a lot of money. We did some kind of wacky creative work. The client put us in review, which is like an RFP for you guys probably. You could either keep it or lose it. We were in the midst of defending it. It was a lot of late nights, a lot of stress. And the founder of the agency, who, God rest his soul, is kind of like a second father to me, said to me, Stoddart, your gift is your passion. And he stopped me in my tracks. And I went home that night and I remember lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, totally demoralized because I thought I'm supposed to be this brilliant business strategist or this leader of clients. And he said, it's my passion. And that's the way I wake up every day. It's my state of being. It's actually, he was right. It's actually the thing that I'm best at. I'm really good with people. I'm good at leading them forward. I'm good on a stage with, a few thousand people. I'm pretty good at that. So I've come to accept that all the things that I've been trying to get good at aren't what I need to give the world. And so that's a long-winded way of saying, go figure out what you're best at. And so my advice to everyone, and I gave it to your son, Ben, actually, when I talked to him, is here's the problem. You don't know what you're good at because you haven't been focusing on it because of the way you focus on your B's and C's. So go ask your mom, your dad, your crazy uncle, your boyfriend, girlfriend, significant other. Ask them 2 questions. What do you think I'm best at? What am I good at? And when do you think I seem most happy? Because those 2 questions, what am I good at and when am I most happy, will define what your personal brand, in my opinion, should be and will define your career path.
That is such a good answer. It is such a good answer. And I think you talk about the big stage, but you're also micro passionate. I think you're just as engaged in a conversation one-on-one as you are on a stage with 2,000 people. And I think, those are the gifts that you do have to take stock of. I mean, I read that book by Carol Dweck a while back, and she talks about having a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And, it's like being smart is not what you should tell people they are, or talented or anything like that. It's actually the doing bits that define who we are, not the talents we have, because we always need to grow. And when you've got passion, you've got energy to grow. You've got energy to be curious and listen. That's what a fantastic answer. Let's talk a little bit about your leadership journey. You've been the CEO of 2 major companies. You were a baby at Leo Burnett and worked your way up to CEO. So let's focus on Leo Burnett a little bit, because I know it wasn't a perfect straight path, because you went to Ford and you did one other job, if I recall correctly. But talk a little bit about that leadership path. What were the things that you look back on and say, okay, I probably did that right along the way? And maybe even what was a failure that you used to spur you or define you?
Yeah, so I guess I'd say I was really never, I don't know why actually this is the case, but I was never afraid to be tossed into a really ugly situation. And actually later in my career, my most recent role, I just sort of pushed myself into a totally different kind of role that I had to learn on the fly and was pretty scary. I had a boss who took on an account that was not going well, and ultimately they lost the account. And I said, Mike, why did you take that assignment? He's like, well, heck, the thing was going sideways anyway. They figure they're going to lose the business. If we lose the business, it wasn't my fault. If I save the business, I'm a hero. And I think sometimes people are so focused on that, whatever that definition of a success is, that they don't allow themselves to go for maximum growth, right? So a growth mindset, because they want an unblemished scorecard. I actually have found that some of the most successful people I've ever met have really blemished scorecards, but they've taken something powerful away from that. So I would say, I think that's what spurred me along. I think the thing that maybe the failure was probably, I was working on McDonald's. I'd been at the agency 10 years. I had a fancy title. And I was kind of miserable. Our life wasn't going well. We'd had our first daughter. The commute was crappy. And I thought I wanted out of the business. I'd lost my passion probably. And, I went to this tiny little agency that was 90 people. 5 years later, I left. We were 900. And it was the rocket ship ride that everyone wants in their career. I hope I get a chance for one more of those. And I desperately did not want to allow that sort of ugly, sort of swampy place that I was in to continue. I wanted to get out of it. What I learned about that, and not until probably 2 or 3 years later, was it wasn't the agency or the account that was the problem. We were just kids playing house with a first child, and we didn't have our lives figured out. And so I was making my own self miserable. My job wasn't making me miserable.
Yeah, the one thing we control is how we narrate our own lives, right? I mean, it's why people drive themselves crazy in a job or a marriage or whatever it is. You get to choose how you narrate it. You can't choose the facts, but you can choose how you narrate those facts. And usually there's plenty of room for positive narration. It's interesting, your struggle concept, because I always think, you and I are both sports fans, and the Dallas Mavericks championship team in 2011 was one of the great teams of all time, because they had no business beating the super team, the Miami Heat. And I remember watching Dirk Nowitzki go from this, European 7-foot great outside shooter who occasionally would drive to the basket. And when he drove to the basket, he would try to get fouled, and he would complain to the ref if he didn't get the call. And then at some point, he started driving to the basket to make the basket. And then if he got the call, he got the call. But he was going to make the basket. He realized he was physically able to just make the basket. And I think that's what turned the Mavericks, interestingly, into this great team and turned him into a player that people talk about. And I think, I feel like your message is such a strong one for people to understand that just go for it. And if you fail, you get a great consolation prize of a little lesson, that you can carry with you to make you better going forward. I love that perspective. Were there moments, were there ad campaigns that you really define your career by? You mentioned Miller Lite. I know that was a proud work for you. Were there things that people would know about that you did that are kind of those campaigns that you say, these were some of the pieces of work that we did together as a team that defined me?
Yeah. So it was Miller Lite, which it's back in the archives. So if anyone who's, much less than younger than 40 probably won't remember it, but it was a campaign that was absolutely crazy, had no strategy because the client told us, he said in the brief, there's no MacGuffin. And by that, he meant there's nothing intrinsic to the product itself that is at all relevant to selling this beer. And so we said, awesome, we need to get young people. We're going to do something that's so off the wall, it's going to attract the attention of young people. And we won every major award in the industry. The strategy was anything can happen at Miller Time. So we sold every piece of work we ever created, because how could the client say it was off strategy? Because basically everything was on strategy. And it didn't work. Sales didn't go up. The CEO got fired. And we got put into review, defended the business, and then ultimately got fired. But I'm still immensely proud. We had a great team, some great friendships. And then, I spent a big hunk of my career on McDonald's. But when I went to this other agency, we pitched a very important new product introduction for McDonald's called the Arch Deluxe, which is a brand new hamburger that they were introducing. And we created some advertising that was I still think was a brilliant strategy. The strategy was, this is a burger that's for grownups, because it's a burger with a grown-up taste was the tagline. And the first work we put out for that was a bunch of kids not spitting the food out of their mouths, but making these terrible faces because they hated it. Because if it wasn't for them, then they wouldn't like it. And it was a massive failure. It was the biggest new product failure in McDonald's history. And we did great work. In that case, I blame it. Actually, I don't think the product was great. And so, there's an adage in our industry that great advertising is the fastest way to kill a bad product. Because if you get people to try something that's no good anyway, it's not going to have success. So I'd say those two. And then the third would be, I was right at the center of the creation of this campaign for Allstate, which had Dean Winters in it, Mayhem. And that campaign lived, over a decade, did a lot of good for that client. And I remember the brief we got from the CMO over lunch on a napkin, just saying, hey, Geico spends $1.2 billion on advertising, but we spend $1.3 billion on agent commissions. So they basically convince people that advertising is a commodity. You should get it for as cheap. 15 minutes and $500, that's cheap, and spend as little money and time with this product as you can. And so what he said on that I wrote down on the napkin, it was, I can't remember the data, but it was the majority of people are underinsured. The majority of people who have a Geico policies are underinsured, and they don't know it. When they find out? When they have a car accident. And so we realized we had to wake people up. And so we created, it's the old angel and the devil, right? Dennis Haysbert was the angel, the representation of the strength and solidity of Allstate, and Dean Winters was Mayhem, the representation of all the bad things that could happen in your life. Very funny campaign that did a lot of good work.
Oh, it really is. I mean, that's a memorable one. I mean, there are a few that really took humor in a way to a new level. When you're looking at the evolution of advertising, when did humor start to get used more impactfully in the history of advertising?
I think humor's been around since the dawn of civilization. And remember that advertising was people hanging a sign outside their blacksmith shop, right? I mean, was the origin of advertising. I think humor really came into vogue, I would say, in the creative revolution in the 60s, shepherded in by Bill Bernbach, and I would argue Leo Burnett to some degree, which said, human emotion needs to be a part. It's not just the transmission of fact. And that's where you got, I can't believe I ate the whole thing, if you remember that classic. I'll talk about Where's the Beef. I mean, you got caricatures and interesting situation and sort of an acknowledgement that the human condition is odd and weird and fraught with relationship foibles and personal foibles and all of that. And so I think that's where it really changed from the model in the 50s was tell people the things they need to know that'll make you buy their brand. And it devalued feeling and valued the rational part of the equation. So I would say that's when it really flipped.
Interesting. And so if you watched the Super Bowl, I know you had some guests and were watching the Super Bowl on Sunday. What, as a casual observer these days, did you particularly like one of the ads, and why?
Well, it's interesting. So I looked at all the reviews the next day, and there was one ad that Ad Age, which is a sort of an advertising's version of whatever your most respected law journal rag is, right? They said it was a triumph, and it was the Springsteen thing for Jeep. And I remember in the moment, sort of kind of boring game. It was the fourth quarter. It didn't really actually hit me. And I've subsequently gone back and appreciated it. In the moment, I'm not sure it really worked for me. But, they said it was a triumph, and so no one can disprove that it was. I tend to, in the Super Bowl, go for humor. I thought Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis for Cheetos was pretty super fun. I thought M&M's, they always do a nice job up front. I did quite love Will Ferrell going to Norway for General Motors.
We never got to Norway. Yeah.
I know. And there's a whole thing happening in the Twitter sphere now. The country of Norway has tweeted back at General Motors about you went to Sweden and we're here and we've got lots of EVs.
We're waiting on you.
Yeah, so those would probably be the three that really struck me.
Yeah, it was fun. I was kind of wishing I'd been with you to relive my freshman year watching commercials with you. We'll have to book that for next Super Bowl Sunday during hopefully a better environment for COVID. Well, that's really interesting. So let me pivot a little bit to, as a CEO, especially most recently with Inner Workings, you deal with lawyers. I mean, this isn't just like you were a creative person your whole life. You didn't have to deal with lawyers, and you dealt with other professionals, right? I mean, being a CEO, you have to understand all that. If you were to give a lesson to lawyers or other professionals like accountants, give them the CEO perspective on where they fall down and where they've done great work for you in the past, those allied professionals you hire.
So look, being a lawyer in an ad agency, your in-house lawyers, it perhaps is the worst job in an agency because you're actually rarely are you helping anyone. The legal department is called the Department of No, right? They cannot say yes. They can only tell me why I can't do what I want to do. But the best and the people who actually rose the highest in the agency believed that while their professional training was in the legal field, that it was fundamentally their responsibility to be creative and to think about, no, but we could do this. What if we did that? How might we be able to solve this problem rather than always focusing on the safest, most least risky, right? I know there's a risk mitigation thing here, but those are the people who never went anywhere in the advertising business. And I think that's generally true, right? It's both bankers and lawyers devalue the role of creativity in what they do because there are these other things that are easier to see in terms of the deliverable, but actually just went through a transaction with, bankers and lawyers on both sides. And the most value I got out of the lawyers was not when they told me, well, this is why this has to be this way, but when they had a different way of thinking about something that caused me to operate differently in the midst of a negotiation or to reframe a value prop. That's when the real value comes in.
Yeah. And to do that, back to your earlier comments, they've really got to understand what your ultimate objectives are so that they can help steer you to the right business solution. That's a great message for folks to really appreciate. I mean, I think it gets back to kind of what you were discussing earlier. Some people feel comfortable in a certain lane, and they've spent all these years learning the law, so you're going to hear what the law is. Whereas the best lawyers really see the law as a tool to solve problems. And
I also found that, I think not many people do it, but especially when you're in the midst of a new engagement, talking to your client about how do they like to communicate and be communicated to most? What is their style? Most people don't do that. They just assume that the way, you need a daily status report by email. I might not want it by email. Might want it once a week on my way into the office at 6 a.m., but via a phone call. And so it doesn't need to be complicated. But, I've learned that people have very different communication styles through my life. And if I can suss that out early, I can be a much more effective advisor if it isn't just sort of left to just sort of happenstance to figure it out.
Great advice. And what were your go-to strategies with your clients in getting information that might provide psychological insights on how to better serve them? I mean, was it doing social events outside? Was it research? What were some of your tricks there?
Yeah. So having sat on the client side of the table, the one thing I've always said to agency people is, do not come in my office and tell me you want to learn about my business. You've just wasted my time, and you've demonstrated that you have no insight, no anything. You haven't done any work.
No passion.
You get tossed out, right? The media salespeople did that to me all the time, So what are the big problems you have? I'm like, okay, go talk to the agent. I don't have time to deal with you. So I would say, don't do that. I do think social engagements of some sort are helpful, and they can see you through some tough times because you have an ability to ask different questions if you've established some kind of trust and rapport. I always said to my people, I don't do lunch. I want to bring something of value to the client. So that's my biggest advice, which is think about how you can bring me something valuable. And it may not be immediately apparent, but I think people who bring value earn trust. Trust is not achieved as a first step. Trust is an outcome. You did the right things. You created value. You looked out for me. You stayed in touch, right? You built a relationship. Now you've got a chance for trust. And so I've always focused on value creation as the number one strategy, because if I really did create value for you, and sometimes you have to differentiate between value for the human you're speaking to and value for the company that they represent. The human may want to get out of that place and get a new job. And you actually can demonstrate value to them by realizing, I've had that happen at times. Yeah, I'd like to get a new gig. Oh, well, in what field? All right, well, I can maybe help connect you, right? So I think that's the number one. I probably over-rev on value creation and under-rev on just the relationship itself, because the relationship feels more shallow to me and less tangible. And that's probably a career mistake that I've made. I haven't leaned into the clients that I've had trouble with are clients where I didn't invest enough in the personal side of the relationship.
Very interesting. Okay. I've got some exit questions for you, so quick hitters. I know you're a big reader. We've shared book recommendations. A book that really changed your perspective on your professional world and why?
Probably Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, because I think it was about creativity and shifts. And I'm sorry, it wasn't Blink. It was the tipping point. How do trends
10,000
change?
hours.
How does culture move? How does expertise get created? I just found that, and I think he's, some of it is more art than science, but that's okay. I found it incredibly motivating, and it made me want to create one of those tipping points, right? Because that's in my professional world. That's what we seek. We want to create a movement. That's what we seek to do. Interesting.
Okay. A mentor you've had, and you mentioned somebody who you thought of as a second father, so maybe that person, but anybody, a mentor you had and how that relationship helped you grow.
Yeah, so it was Pat Fallon, who founded Fallon, the agency, which is still around. So Pat was a diminutive little insecure Irish genius, and he was absolutely open and embracing of his own failings, and he built a team. He put a team around him to compensate for his own failings, which is a really remarkable thing for a leader to do. And I saw him do it, at his funeral, which was attended by thousands of people. There were people that couldn't get in, because they were waiting on the street. He had already scripted his own funeral. He had already asked his high school girlfriend if she'd do it. And by the way, he wasn't sick. He had a brain aneurysm, tragically driving his kid to school. It was just out of the blue. His brief for the funeral was, show me as I was, warts and all. Right. And so this was a guy that just lived that way. And he built a company where flaws were not to be hidden. Flaws were meant to go out in the open, and everyone knew what everybody's flaws were. And then we helped you sort of work around them. That I've always carried that with me. It sounds a little twisted, by the way, and it was, but it really worked.
Well, it would have been a very entertaining funeral, first of all.
Absolutely.
But, the message of authenticity is perfect because you just, it's so much easier to live authentically. You don't have to hide anything. The last one I think I'm going to ask you, and I steal this one, I think, from Tim Ferriss, but it's perfect for you, which is if you could put a message on a billboard that people all around the world would see every day translated into their language, what would it say?
Well, I'm going to flip it a little bit because, and this is probably a good end to this conversation. So, and my family knows this. So I've written what goes on my tombstone, and it's just, he did the right thing. Just that. That's how I try to make every decision and live my life. I don't get it right all the time, but mostly I sleep well at night knowing that if that was my intent and I tried my best to do that, then that's been an okay day.
Yeah, well, from my experience, and I've known you a little while, I think you're living that motto to the fullest. I appreciate so much, Rich, your authenticity and the way you've shared these stories. I don't know that I would have expected some of the answers you gave, and I think a lot of people are going to listen to them and really benefit from this conversation. Maybe your next act involves writing a book because you've got a lot in there to share, and I know people will listen to this and they will feel enriched by it. So thank you so much for your time.
Cheers, Craig. Great to join you. And anyone who wants Craig Budner's stories of Craig at 18, 19 years old, just ring me up on email.
They're all false. Fake news, every one of them. Take care.
Cheers, guys.
See you soon.